Hello everyone and welcome back to the Angular University. In this lesson we're going to be introducing Angular signals. So I'm going to do a quick demonstration and let you see what a signal looks like. So we're going to take here a very simple application. It's just a plain component with a counter that gets incremented here via a button. And we're going to convert this into a signal-based example, and we're going to compare the differences between this very simple implementation that uses a mutable variable and the implementation that we're going to have at the end, which is going to be using signals. So without further ado, let's get started. So the whole idea with signals is that you are not going to be able to do this kind of things most of the times in your applications. If you want Angular to be notified that your data is being changed via signals, then you need to make sure that all your data is inside a signal. So this counter variable will no longer be a number. Instead, we are going to turn it into a signal using the Angular signal API. All right. And we need to pass in here the initial value of the signal that we're going to set to 0. So a signal, it's like a wrapper or a container for a value. What we have here, if I hit Ctrl+Shift+P, is no longer a number. This is instead a writable signal of type number. This means that this is a signal that contains a value inside it. That value must be of type number. Now, how do we increment the signal? Clearly, this doesn't work anymore, so we're going to delete it for the moment. And right now, I'm going to switch here to our application component, and we are going to start by printing the value of the signal. So if you want to access the value of the signal, all you have to do is to call the signal like if it was a function. All right. And if we hit here Command S, we should see that this code is working correctly. And this is the initial value of the signal. So if I set it to 100 and I refresh the application, you can see here that the counter value is indeed 100. All right. So let me set it back to 0 then. So this is the first thing that it's important to bear in mind about signals. In order to access the value that they are wrapping, you just call them like they were functions. You can imagine that they are getter functions in an Angular component. You call them and you get back the value that they are wrapping. Now the question is, how can we change the value of this signal? Because if I increment it here, you can see nothing is happening, right? So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to modify the signal. And you have here several alternatives for doing this. And let me turn off here GitHub Copilot so that the auto-completion, in this case, we don't want it, right? Now, let's go ahead and let's access here the counter signal. And we can see that we have here several methods, but not that many. The signal API, it's quite simple to understand. So that's one of the appeals of using signals compared to something much more advanced like RxJS to handle the data, the values of data of your application. With signals, everything is much easier to understand, reason about, and maintain. So I'm going to modify here the counter and I'm going to call here the set API, and I'm going to set a new value for the signal. So first of all, I want to increment the signal, right? So let me get the current value, and I'm going to call here the counter with these brackets so that it's like calling a function. And I'm going to say that the new value is the value of the counter plus 1. All right. And let me go ahead and let me save this. And now if I increment here, we're going to see that the counter is getting updated as usual. So as you can see, the signal API is fairly straightforward to understand. We're going to dive much deeper into it in the next few lessons. This is just the fundamentals. But we can see straight away that introducing the notion of signal didn't significantly complicate our program. It's true that using signals is just not as convenient as using plain mutable JavaScript variables. But introducing signals into this simple example, it's not the end of the world either. It's fairly straightforward and easy to understand. But now you are probably wondering, what is the benefit of wrapping my data in this kind of container, this wrapper, which is the signal? Well, the main advantage of putting all your data inside a signal is that the signal makes it extremely easy for Angular to detect that your data has changed. So whenever you set your new data here using this counter set method, it's possible for Angular to be notified when the signal value changes, and based on that information, Angular will determine that this component that is using the signal needs to be updated. So instead of, like it's the case of default change detection, Angular having to kind of in a brute force way, if you will, compare the values of the expressions of the whole component tree before and after an event, like a click, that is a computationally expensive operation that Angular does in default change detection. But imagine that if instead Angular would be using signals to determine what parts of the page need to be updated, Angular could then update the page in a much more optimal way. There wouldn't be this need for scanning and diffing the whole component tree. Angular would be aware that it was just this component that changed and that it was just this expression that uses the signal that has a new value that needs to be updated. So if the Angular change detection system is plugged into signals, that means that Angular can, in a much more optimal and efficient way, update the page with the latest values of your data. So the small trade-off that you have to do is to understand the notion of signal and make sure that you put all your application data inside a signal. What I mean by that is any data that you use in a template somewhere, you need to put it inside a signal in order for this to work. Alright, so this is the basics of signals. It's just an introduction. As you can see, it's kind of a container of a wrapper to a value that makes it easy for Angular and also the rest of our application to detect that a value has changed. So signals are not just about an improved change detection in Angular. Even though that is huge, that's a huge benefit to be able to get rid of the library that has historically enabled Angular default change detection, which is Zone.js. With signals, we are going to be able to get rid of Zone.js in our applications. Zone.js, as you know, it works most of the time, but when it doesn't, the errors that it generates can be a little bit tricky to understand and debug and require a bit more of an advanced knowledge of the framework. So those kinds of errors are a bit surprising to beginners. Signals would also help with that. Besides those two advantages, Signals is also a great way of writing applications in declarative reactive style. So we have some data in our application. If other parts of the application need to change when that data changes, then we don't need to notify those other parts of the application that something has changed. They just consume the signal, and the signal, by the way that it works, is going to propagate the changes in its internal value to any interested subscribers, to any interested parts of the application. In Signal terminology, those would be the consumers of the signal. Alright, so I hope that this gives you an overview of what are signals, how they work, and why they are useful and important in Angular. Let's then continue to explore the Signals API. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk to you about read-only signals and the Signal Update API in Angular.